Welcome to session 5, and this session we'll be looking at video for peer and self-assessment or self-critique, which obviously developing a valuable skill in the students themselves. First up today we have Dr. Sian Ritchie, who is Associate Professor in the School of Biological Sciences at Washington State University. So a special thanks, I think, to Sian for coming to us live from the US, which I think it's 4 a.m. if I'm not mistaken right now. So a special thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you're set there to share.
Thank you. So I'm with kind of shifting gears a little bit now, because I'm talking about students making a video and fairly traditional kind of presentation in the class, and then actually watching themselves after the fact and kind of, mulling over how they've done, and then, hopefully improving once they've watched themselves. So this is where I am. I'm the top left corner of the USA. So the university that I work at is a pretty average size for an American university. We have a strong agricultural background, and for research at the university, we have a very mixed bag of undergraduates. There isn't much in the way of admissions criteria. So we have a really broad range of students. But by the time we get to the class that I'm talking about today, they've either left or they're pretty solid students. And I work in the biology department, and the class that I'm talking about is called Professional Communications in Biology. So it's taken by students either in their final year or the third year. The degrees are 4 years in the States. And so the theme of the class is basically technical writing in biology, and then also giving pretty sort of standard presentations on their topic. So they pick a topic, they write a technical paper that's basically a review, a bunch of primary research papers pushed together in some kind of synthesis. And then they do a standard oral presentation in the classroom based on the paper. And one of the remits for this category of class or university is that they get the chance to receive feedback, and then they get the chance to resubmit or redo whatever assignment it is. So they get to rewrite the paper, they get to do a second presentation after they had a bunch of feedback. And it's a small class, so it's very, very manageable. So what I have here is kind of the standard layout of the class that I was teaching for a couple of years, a few years ago. So there's the paper, they get the instructor feedback, they rewrite the paper based on, my comments. And they usually take that seriously and do a pretty good job of it. And then same content, they give this presentation, then I give them feedback. I also would always do peer feedback as well, although honestly, I would mostly do it just to make sure that students are showing up to class and paying attention. And then they get all that feedback, and then they do the presentation again. So the thing that was a little bit frustrating for me is that they would do a pretty good job of revising their paper, but the second presentation, often they would not really bother to improve it very much. They hadn't really taken anything very seriously. So I've always recorded the presentations in the classroom, and really mostly for me originally, because I like to, when I'm in the classroom, just enjoy the science and think about it. And then I record the presentation so I can assess it later and look at all the various different kind of aspects of it. But what I decided was I needed to do something about this lack of improvement in the presentation skills, because there's so many kind of soft transferable skills that they learn when they take this seriously that are useful regardless of whatever kind of career they go on to once they finish their degrees. So what I decided to do was I got lucky. I actually had 2 sections of the same class. So I actually got to do an experiment. So the first section, I just did the same as normal. I basically had so that's the right-hand side. So they gave the presentation, I gave them feedback, the peers gave them feedback, and I just told them, well, the the presentation is recorded, so watch it, it's useful. And very few of them actually do. And then they redid their presentation. So my intervention was pretty, small and simple. And what I did with the middle group right here, with our the treatment, was I gave them the same rubric as they had for my rubric and the peer rubric, but I made them watch their recorded presentation and turn in their self-assessment before I would give them any other feedback, so they couldn't just kind of cheat and copy or whatever. And then they redid the presentation. So I really just have two groups of students. The only difference is they have to watch themselves in the intervention group. So, I've done lots of little tinkering and experiments with classes over the years, and often things don't really make any difference. So I was rather pleasantly surprised because it worked. The students, they did much better when they had to watch themselves. So this graph is broken down into groups. So, let me explain a couple of things first. So the score for this presentation was out of 25. So that's the maximum number of points they could get for this particular assignment. And the score on the second presentation was really much more focused on improvement rather than the absolute quality of the presentation. So that's my real goal, is to get them to do better. The first score is on the quality, the second score is on improvement. So I divided up the scores on the presentation into three broad categories. So the 22 to 25 grade range, that's students that made a good effort to improve all the different aspects of their presentations. And the ones that are in these kind of lower grade ranges, they might have improved a few things, but they didn't really do everything. And then the ones in less than 18 points, that's really, they really didn't make much effort at all. So what we have here is the black bars. This is the control group. This is the very typical of a normal semester, a normal term, where, there's still half the students that are making a good effort and improving their presentations in the second round. But there's also another half that really just, they pretty much give the same presentation. So when I made them watch themselves, that's what the white bars are. You can see basically that almost all the students did a really good effort in improving all sorts of different aspects of their presentation. So I was really very pleasantly surprised by this. And, if you take the numbers kind of differently and you run t-tests and everything, it was a significant difference in the scores. So I was really quite chuffed. So the other one of the things that I looked at was the kind of things that they were improving, if there were some kind of themes. So generally they were really obviously better practiced, and then not surprisingly the timing was better. The way they were speaking was better. They'd be more sort of ups and downs. There'd be a good pace. The scientific aspects of it, one of the things that a lot of students struggle with is explaining graphs and data they put up, and they never really take enough time over that. So that was a thing that it's a concrete thing that they were able to work on and did quite well in that. So those were the main areas where the students improved. So some of it was transferable sort of soft skills, and some of it was more, science specific. What are we doing for time? So, and the other thing that I looked at was that a lot of literature on this kind of self-assessment is comparing self-assessment and instructor assessment and peer assessment. And the literature is basically students are not terribly good overall at self-assessing when you compare with instructor versus peer. So these are Pearson's R values. So, 0.55, that's pretty decent correlation between the instructor and the peer grades that are being assigned. Whereas the Pearson's values for the self are pretty lousy, basically. They're really not very good overall in scoring themselves. But I think in this case, it really doesn't matter, because the bottom line is that they're taking the time and energy to improve their presentations. And so the fact that the correlations are bad, it doesn't really bother me, because they're getting better. That's the goal, right? Students doing better. And the other thing that my kind of final conclusion is that when the students were told I was telling them I was doing this, they were a bit like, oh, scared you're going to record me. But by the time we were done, they were all like super, wow, that was really helpful. So nobody really likes to watch themselves in this kind of scenario. Giving presentations is one of those things that stresses a lot of people out, but they definitely saw the value of it in the end, which was also quite gratifying. So I'd like to thank Geraldine for inviting me to come and give this little talk, and your university. And yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Jan. That's really interesting to see such a stark change, such a stark improvement. We have one question, I think, or there's a couple have actually come in VVox. So first off, it's so important, self-assessment. How much feedback would you usually give, and is that written or verbal?
It's written, yeah. I have a standard kind of sheet with there's lots of different kinds of criteria, and I make quite a lot of comments that's why I like to record it, because I can really watch a presentation at home in the evening and really go through and get to the fine details of the best way to improve.
Okay, so quite a deep rubric.
Yeah.
Assessment. Okay, very good.
It is, yeah. I have it all. I have slides of stuff, but there's lots.
And that's shared back with them, is it, in that format?
Sorry?
Is that shared back at that level of detail to the students?
It is. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. It's quite involved.
Another question there, just on that, if this has been shown in the literature before, and if weaker students are not facilitated by the self-assessment, would that be a fair?
Yeah, weaker students, they tend to be, and I have data as well, that the weaker students tend to be worse at scoring themselves. So the better students are better. Yeah, they're better at self-assessing. The weaker students are they're not as good at giving themselves accurate scores. But what I found was that it didn't matter. Even the weaker students improved. And because my grading system is based on improvement rather than kind of absolute scores, I would say that maybe their presentations still weren't as good as the really stellar students. But the fact that they got better at all, I consider to be a small victory. Because, yeah, they don't have as much metacognitive kind of skills. I think that's the kind of psychology behind it.
Okay, very good. Just one last comment from myself. I just saw that it was interesting. I was just wondering, was that improvement gained without any additional work for you? As in, was this just their own assessment, and did it require any additional work on your part?
Yeah, it wasn't any more work on my part, because I already do the standard amount of grading. The peers already did their grading. So it was a bit more shuffling of papers or whatever, but it was really very little more work. Yeah.
So all the better.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. It was really, really interesting.
You're welcome.
Up next, we have Patricia Cartney, who is the head of social work at University of Manchester, and she will be talking to us about using video interviewing in the assessment of social work communication skills.
Thank you very much, Geraldine and colleagues, for inviting me today to present my work. And I think it fits really nicely with the presentation that Sian's just given. So just today, obviously it's 10 minutes, so it's very whistle-stop tour, but I'm going to present a very brief outline of some previous research I'd taken, which was actually quite a few years ago now, but it's interesting because its relevance is still, very clear today, I think, and we've built upon that more, and the key findings that I'm going to outline today, we've tried to put into practice as our teaching's gone forward. So hopefully it's quite helpful to think about that together today. So a brief background to the research. I've put a link to the paper, well, I've put a reference to the paper at the end. So if anybody's wanting to find out about the ethics, the data analysis, etc., that's all there. I'm not going to go into those details today in 10 minutes, because otherwise that would take the whole 10 minutes. So just in a nutshell, the teaching team moved from using essays to using video assessments to sort of get a more authentic assessment about how students communicated. Now, when I read that now, that sounds really quite dated. You think, well, who is using essays nowadays to to test students' communications? And I think, life has moved on technologically in that sense. Obviously, students now take selfies the whole time. We're much more aware of ourselves as sort of, as digital beings in that sense. But I'm trying to sort of get to the bottom line here about the use of video and the use of self-assessment in that process. So just to outline, in the assessment, the students are given a scenario and then they undertake 10-minute interviews with a paid actor in the research. So they're social work students, so they might be on practice placements, which are sort of half of their course. Half is academic based, half is out practicing in the community. So for example, they might be asked to support a mother with depression, with support her children, and she's been referred to services for support. And so the students, that might be one scenario they're given, and then they have sort of 10-15 minutes to prepare, and then they undertake a 10-minute interview. And as I say, at this point, this was with a sort of paid actor. And then the students were videoed while they're doing this. And then sort of, years ago, we used to give them a little videotape, little cassette they used to take home and play on their, on their recorders. But nowadays, obviously, it's all digital and it's there on the VLE for them to upload and download afterwards. But the sort of a key there is that the students are watching their own videos afterwards. And as Sian said, I think this can be really crucial. It's this sort of re-watching, re-seeing, and you see things, and students always say they see things they weren't aware of, and it really does make them sort of, I think, critically reflect on their performance. Now, they're watching their own videos, and the critical reflection is a written reflection. It's a 2,500 word assignment. So in the research that I undertook, most students across the two cohorts completed the questionnaires we sent out. So 50 out of 65 students returned a questionnaire. And then we did a focus group of 10 students who had volunteered to come forward for the focus group. So the key findings, the first key finding I wanted to sort of point out was about this impact of performance anxiety. And I know Sian in her presentation picked that up as well. And people were saying things like, this was quite an apposite comment, was, I thought this is a test and I have to do my best. But when I was there, it was my worst. I was completely frozen. And there were quite a lot of, quite sort of, intense sort of anxiety that came out particularly in the focus group about this. And some of the students I think they were surprised about how anxious they actually were in the assessment situation. They found this sort of performance on camera really difficult. Now, that might be a little bit, if we did that research again now, everyone's on selfies, they're constantly videoing, birthday parties, etc. That anxiety might go down. But I wonder if, because it's assessment focused, whether it might remain, because it's very different, doing a selfie with your friends in the pub as opposed to being assessed on, on using a video. And the second theme that came out was about the artificial nature of the interview. And some students were saying, well, it's too unnatural, it's too clinical. They were pointing out, if you were actually you know, if they were in their offices, so in social services offices at work, or if they were in people's home, there'd be posters, there'd be other things around them. And but looking back now, when we, you know, when we had actually conducted this research, they were in a sort of filming suite, and there was a big, you know, there was a big curtain around. There were 4 cameras, you know, down on them, and they were just sat opposite an actor. So I, you know, I think that was actually a very fair point. And I'll say a little bit about in a moment about how we've changed that obviously since then. But I think another issue that which is an important issue here was that using this sort of simulation of, you know, using an actor, it wasn't a real interview, students were saying. The person wasn't actually a service user coming forward for support, so they found that really difficult. And they were saying things, and I think that again still applies very much nowadays, that, you know, if you're interviewing somebody and you're going into their house, you'd say, oh gosh, the weather's terrible today, isn't it? You know, you'd have a little bit of leeway in there where you're trying to build rapport, whereas they had 10 minutes in which they had to sort of, you know, pull out some key information. And I think this sort of idea about authenticity is, you know, pretty much a perennial issue when you're using assessments that are not actually sort of, you know, representing complete reality. They're just sort of trying to be authentic enough in that process. And the third theme that came out was that they really liked the video. They found it, you know, and they said, you know, if you did a bad interview, you learned from it, you saw what you'd done wrong, and you could think about how you might put it right. And if you did good, they said, wow, you got more confidence for that. And so they very much saw that this sort of self-reflective account as really helpful for their learning. And they said, you know, it was so important to see themselves with their own eyes, what they were doing and what they needed to improve. And they loved being able to rewind, go back over things, you know, sort of review them and think, oh yeah, that I shouldn't have interrupted at that point, or, you know, I should have done this. And it was very sort of real, very authentic and very live for them. And they were able to sort of link with theoretical concepts as well and start to think about the theories about, you know, helping and communicating. So I think all round, you know, being able to reflect outside of the performance and afterwards. So, you know, this sort of notion of reflection after action, I think was really crucial for the students. So in terms of the learning we took forward, you know, as I say, you know, over the years since that original research was taken, there's been really many changes in technology and social media. And I think, you know, this idea of being seen and being seen as the social self may have changed a little bit more since then. But one of the issues we picked up is that students needed more practice before they undertook the filmed interviews. So we now do practice interviews, and they interview their peers and they get formative feedback, which I think does really help that whole process. And we now have a less clinical sort of skills lab in the way that used to take place. We now have a home environment. So there's a sort of door that students knock on and come in, and there's a sofa and there's a sink and there's toys on the floor and the cameras are hidden. And we have service users themselves now, rather than actors playing the part of service users, though they don't bring their own issues and their own problems. They're still working with scenarios. But I think that again gives it a bit more of an authentic feel for the students. And we've had a lot more dialogue over the years now with students about authenticity in that process. And we've stayed with the importance of self-reflection as their assessed piece in that sense, because I think that, well, that was very much, and it is still very much our feedback from our students, that they get a bit too frightened in that, because it's quite new, you know, it's quite sort of early on in the course, and that to be assessed on the actual interview presentation feels a bit high risk. And I think for us, we're in quite a good position really, because our students, as I say, have 50% practice experience. So they do this with us just before they go out to practice. So their learning can be staged. We can assess them on their reflections on their practice, and then they go out into practice placements, and their practice educators can actually assess them, interviewing service users directly. So they are the people who can take the actual direct interview assessment, but we've prepared them through our use of video assessment. Just that's the reference if anybody wanted to sort of follow that up, and then over to you for questions.
Excellent, Patricia. Thanks very much for that. I was it's really interesting there, the pieces you picked up on, like changing the set. I can only imagine how, you mentioned there authenticity is important in, I suppose, all types of assessment. But it's that idea of practicing. I know myself from the first videos I would have done for teaching purposes, I absolutely hated hearing my own voice back. And that idea of practicing with their peers and getting that experience even in the educational setting is great. Do they do much of that practice with their peers?
Yes, we do actually, in different, and I think over the year, and it was interesting what Sian said, because I think sometimes that students really up their game if they're having to, if they're putting something in and they, oh, well, this will be good enough, I'll get a pass. Whereas actually, if they know their peers, often even formatively assessing it, they want to do that, they don't want to appear, they don't know things in front of their peers. So I think it can be really, really powerful.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. And there's a comment there on VBox, I think, for clarification, they don't get marked on the interview. It's all based on the self-reflection. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Because this is our first year students, and it's just before they go out onto their practice placement. So we don't mark the interview for this. We just mark the self-reflection. And then when they go on placement, that's obviously when they start doing real interviews with real people, and they get assessed by their practice educator then on the actual interviews they're performing. But yes, for this, we're sort of lowering the stakes a bit and allowing them a bit of a practice.
Okay, so it's not the technical details of the interview, it's how they reflect upon it. Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, and there's one more just after popping up there. Including service users is so powerful as it gives students a clear sense of the real environment. Yeah, I took that as well. That was really good. Because again, to my first comment, the idea of keeping an authentic setting, I'm sure, puts them more in a real type of scenario and rather than in a film studio. Yeah. And just the last comment there, are the service users okay to participate? I suppose even to break.
I mean, we work really closely with service users on the programme, and obviously, we pay our service users for their involvement, and they're involved in lots of different places. They are involved with recruiting students for us, they're involved in our skills days. So it's quite, it's quite a common thing in social workers to have service users participate. And they do really like it on the whole, actually. And they say things like, they give feedback to the student afterwards. And our service users say they see it as this is their chance to try to help social workers learning, so that when they go out into practice, when they're qualified, actually they're good social workers, because the service user role has been helping them to get it right.
Yeah, perfect. The ideal feedback. Okay, that's perfect. We are absolutely bang on time. I've never seen a conference run absolutely on time. So thanks to our speakers in this session. We have a lunch break now, which we won't keep you from, and I think we're back at 2:15. So yeah, Geraldine has it up there in the slide for you. So thank you very much to Sian and Patricia for your talks there, and indeed all the speakers this morning. I think it's been really useful and very good session. So thank you all.